Right now, as you're watching this video, millions of Americans are driving home on highways that have witnessed unspeakable tragedies. Some roads remember every scream, every last breath, every moment of terror. Tonight, I'm taking you on a journey through America's most haunted asphalt, where the dead don't rest and the living wish they'd never stopped their engines. You think you know fear? You think you've heard every ghost story? Think again. These aren't campfire tales or urban legends passed down through generations. These are documented encounters, witnessed by real people, on real highways that you might drive tomorrow night. From the phantom trucker of Route 491, who appears in your mirrors just before you die, to the screaming bridge where college students vanish without a trace, to the headless flagman who saves lives while seeking revenge for his own brutal death. Each story will drag you deeper into a nightmare that spans from coast to coast, connected by something far more sinister than coincidence. But here's what makes this different from every other horror channel you've subscribed to. I don't just tell you ghost stories. I take you inside the minds of the witnesses, into the police reports, into the very fabric of terror that these highways have woven into American folklore. If you're ready to discover why some roads should never be traveled alone, why certain exits should never be taken, and why the next time you see headlights in your rearview mirror at 3 a.m., you'll remember this moment. Then hit that subscribe button for verified fears right now, because once you start this journey with me, there's no turning back. Ring that notification bell, because trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Are you ready to face the truth about what lurks on America's highways? Let's find out together. Let's move to our first story. And I want you to understand something right from the start. This isn't just another trucker ghost tale you've heard around truck stops. This is about Marcus Big Mike Rodriguez, a 23-year veteran of the long haul. A man who'd driven every godforsaken stretch of asphalt from Seattle to Miami and never believed in anything he couldn't see, touch, or fix with a wrench. Marcus was the kind of driver other truckers respected. Punctual, professional, and practical to his core. He'd laugh at the CB radio ghost stories, the tales of phantom hitchhikers and spectral semis that supposedly haunted America's highways. That skepticism kept him sane through decades of midnight runs until one October night on Route 491 in Colorado, when everything he thought he knew about the road changed forever. Route 491 has a history that most drivers prefer not to discuss. Originally designated as Highway 666, it earned the nickname the Devil's Highway, not just for its ominous number, but for the disproportionate number of fatal accidents that occurred along its 200-mile stretch through Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah. The highway was renumbered in 2003 after years of sign theft and mounting pressure from religious groups. But changing numbers doesn't erase the blood that's been spilled on that asphalt. Marcus knew the statistics. He'd driven 491 hundreds of times. But statistics never kept him awake at night. What happened on October 15, 2019, however, would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was 2:47 a.m. when Marcus pulled his Peterbilt 379 onto Route 491 southbound, hauling a load of construction equipment from Denver to Albuquerque. The night was clear, temperature hovering around 38 degrees, with that crisp mountain air that usually made driving a pleasure. His CB radio crackled with the usual late-night chatter. Drivers sharing weather reports, warning about speed traps, the comfortable camaraderie of the road. Sarah Chen, his regular dispatch operator, had checked in at 2:30 a.m., confirming his route and expected arrival time. Everything was routine, everything was normal, until Marcus glanced in his passenger side mirror and saw the headlights. At first, there was nothing unusual about another semi running the same route. The headlights appeared about a quarter-mile back, maintaining a steady distance, neither gaining nor falling behind. Marcus thought nothing of it. Professional drivers often found themselves in informal convoys, especially on long, lonely stretches like 491. But as the miles passed, something began to feel wrong. The truck behind him never varied its distance, never changed lanes, never even seemed to sway with the natural rhythm of the road. It was as if those headlights were locked onto his trailer, following with mechanical precision that no human driver could maintain. By mile marker 47, Marcus's unease had grown into genuine concern. He tried raising the trailing driver on the CB, cycling through channels 19, 17, and 9, but received no response. The headlights remained constant, unwavering, almost hypnotic in their steadiness. Marcus decided to test his follower. He gradually reduced his speed from 65 to 55 miles per hour, then to 50. The headlights maintained their exact distance. He accelerated back to 70 miles per hour, pushing his rig harder than he normally would on the winding mountain highway. Still, the distance never changed. It was as if the truck behind him was somehow tethered to his own vehicle, matching his every movement with supernatural precision. The first real sign that something was terribly wrong came at mile marker 52, when Marcus noticed that the headlights in his mirror were wrong. They weren't the standard round or rectangular beams of modern trucks. They were old-fashioned sealed beam headlights, the kind that hadn't been used on commercial vehicles since the 1970s. The light itself had a yellowish, almost sickly quality that seemed to penetrate the darkness in an unnatural way. Marcus rubbed his eyes, thinking fatigue was playing tricks on him. But when he looked again, the lights were still there, still wrong, still following. At 3:15 a.m., Marcus made a decision that probably saved his life. He pulled into the Cortez truck stop at mile marker 61, hoping to force a confrontation with his mysterious follower. As he guided his Peterbilt into the parking area, he watched his mirrors intently, waiting to see what kind of truck had been shadowing him for the past 30 miles. But as he completed his turn into the truck stop, the headlights simply vanished. Not dimmed, not turned off. Vanished, as if they had never existed at all. Marcus sat in his cab for 20 minutes, engine idling, scanning the highway and the truck stop. But there was no sign of another vehicle anywhere. Shaken but determined to complete his run, Marcus pulled back onto Route 491 at 3:45 a.m. For the next 15 miles, the highway was empty, just the way he preferred it. His CB radio had gone silent. Not unusual for the late hour, but somehow the silence felt oppressive, as if the very air around his truck had thickened. Then, at mile marker 76, the headlights returned. This time, they appeared much closer, maybe 100 yards behind his trailer, and Marcus could swear he heard the deep rumble of a diesel engine that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. What happened next defied every law of physics Marcus understood. The phantom truck began to overtake him, but instead of pulling into the left lane, it seemed to be passing through the median, its headlights visible through the scrub brush and rocky terrain that should have made such a maneuver impossible. Marcus watched in horror as the ghostly semi pulled alongside his cab, and for the first time, he could see the truck itself. It was a 1970s Kenworth, painted in a faded blue that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The cab was dented and scarred, with what looked like bullet holes peppering the driver's side door. But it was the driver that made Marcus's blood freeze in his veins. The figure behind the wheel was barely human, a skeletal frame wrapped in the tattered remains of a flannel shirt, with empty eye sockets that somehow still managed to convey malevolent intelligence. The phantom driver turned to look directly at Marcus, and in that moment, Marcus heard a voice that seemed to come from inside his own head. "You're driving on my road now, boy. Time to pay the toll." The ghostly truck began to crowd Marcus's rig, forcing him toward the guardrail and the 200-foot drop beyond. Marcus fought the wheel, his years of experience the only thing keeping his truck on the asphalt as the phantom semi tried to push him over the edge. The battle lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Marcus downshifted, using his engine brake to slow his rig, while the phantom truck continued its relentless pressure. Just when it seemed like the guardrail would give way and send Marcus plummeting into the canyon below, the ghost truck suddenly accelerated and disappeared into the darkness ahead, leaving behind only the acrid smell of burning rubber and something else. Something that reminded Marcus of a morgue. Marcus managed to bring his truck to a stop at mile marker 82, his hands shaking so badly he could barely key his CB radio. When he finally raised Sarah Chen at dispatch, his voice was barely a whisper. "Sarah, I need you to document this call. Time is 4:23 a.m., October 15th. I've just had an encounter with... I don't know what to call it. Another truck tried to run me off the road. But it wasn't normal." Sarah's voice crackled back, concerned and professional. "Marcus, are you injured? Do you need emergency services?" Marcus looked at his mirrors, at the empty highway stretching in both directions, and realized how insane his story would sound. "No, Sarah, I'm okay. Just log that I had to make an emergency stop due to aggressive driver behavior." But Marcus wasn't okay, and he knew it. As he prepared to resume his journey, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There, burned into the asphalt beside his truck, were tire marks, not from his own vehicle, but from another semi. The marks were deep, as if made by a truck carrying an impossibly heavy load. And they formed a pattern that Marcus recognized from his military days. The skid marks spelled out a date: October 15th, 1974. Exactly 45 years ago to the day. Marcus completed his run to Albuquerque, but he never drove Route 491 again. He researched the date burned into the road and discovered that on October 15th, 1974, a trucker named Dale Morrison had been found dead in his overturned Kenworth at mile marker 82. The official cause of death was listed as a single-vehicle accident. But the investigating officer's notes mentioned something strange. Morrison's truck had been found with bullet holes in the driver's side door, and his body showed signs of a struggle. The case was never solved, and Dale Morrison was buried in an unmarked grave in Cortez, Colorado. Marcus retired from long-haul trucking 6 months later, but he still monitors the CB radio channels that cover Route 491. Every few months, he hears the same story. A trucker reporting aggressive behavior from another semi, always at night, always around mile marker 82. The descriptions are always the same. An old Kenworth with yellowish headlights, a skeletal driver, and the overwhelming smell of death. Marcus has tried to warn other drivers, but most dismiss his story as road fatigue or too much coffee. Those who believe him simply find another route. Because some roads, Marcus learned, never forget their dead, and some drivers never stop collecting their toll. Let's move to our second story. And this one will make you question everything you think you know about protective spirits and the price of curiosity. This takes us to the backwoods of Pennsylvania, where Susquehanna Road winds through dense forests and forgotten valleys like a scar across the landscape. This isn't a highway you'd find on any tourist map. It's a narrow, crumbling strip of asphalt that locals avoid after dark, and for good reason. The road earned its reputation in 1952 when a young woman named Catherine Mills drove her car off the bridge at Dead Man's Curve, plunging into the rocky creek bed below. Her screams echoed through the valley that night, and according to every generation since, they've never stopped. But what happened to 3 college students on Halloween night 2021 proves that some legends are far more dangerous than anyone imagined. Sophia Blackwood was a junior at Penn State, majoring in folklore and mythology, with a kind of academic curiosity that often leads to trouble. She'd been researching local legends for her thesis on supernatural folklore in rural Pennsylvania when she stumbled across references to the Susquehanna Screamer, a ghostly woman in white who appeared on the demolished bridge, warning drivers of impending doom with blood-curdling screams. The story fascinated Sophia because, unlike most ghost tales, this one had specific rules. You had to arrive at the bridge site at exactly midnight, honk your horn 3 times, and wait. If Catherine Mills deemed you worthy of her warning, she would appear and scream. If she didn't appear, it meant you were safe. If she appeared but remained silent, it meant your death was imminent and unavoidable. What made Sophia's research particularly compelling was the consistency of the accounts. Every witness described the same ritual, the same timing, the same bone-chilling scream that could shatter car windows and leave grown men weeping. The bridge itself had been demolished in 1987 after 3 separate fatal accidents in a single month. But the apparition continued to appear at the original location, standing on invisible stone arches that no longer existed. Local historian Margaret Kowalski had documented over 40 encounters since 1952, and in every case where Catherine Mills appeared but remained silent, the witness died within 72 hours. Car accidents, heart attacks, freak industrial accidents, always something that could be explained away as coincidence. Sophia's academic interest became personal obsession when she discovered that her own great-grandmother, Helen Blackwood, had been one of Catherine Mills's victims. According to family records, Helen had encountered the silent screamer in 1963 and died 2 days later when her car's brakes failed on a steep hill. The official accident report noted that the brake lines had been severed, but the investigation concluded it was due to road salt corrosion. Sophia knew better. She understood that Catherine Mills wasn't just a warning system. She was a judge, jury, and executioner, deciding who lived and who died, based on criteria that no living person understood. On Halloween night 2021, Sophia convinced her boyfriend Jake Morrison and their friend Destiny Kim to accompany her to Susquehanna Road for what she called field research. Jake was a psychology major who believed that ghost stories were manifestations of collective trauma, while Destiny studied engineering and approached the supernatural with scientific skepticism. Both agreed to the expedition more to humor Sophia than out of any genuine belief in the legend. They drove Jake's Honda Civic through the winding mountain roads, following Sophia's hand-drawn map to the exact coordinates where the bridge had once stood. The location was eerily preserved, as if time had stopped the moment the bridge was demolished. The old stone abutments still jutted from either side of Willow Creek, connected by nothing but 30 feet of empty air and decades of accumulated dread. Ancient oak trees formed a natural cathedral around the site, their bare branches creating twisted shadows in the moonlight. The only sounds were the gentle babbling of the creek below and the distant hoot of an owl. But there was something else, a tension in the air that made all three students speak in whispers without realizing why. At 11:58 p.m., Sophia positioned Jake's car at the exact spot where the bridge approach had been, facing the gap where the span once crossed. She had researched the ritual extensively, cross-referencing multiple sources to ensure they followed the protocol precisely. The horn had to be honked 3 times in quick succession. Then they had to wait in complete silence for exactly 3 minutes. If Catherine Mills appeared, they were to remain in the car no matter what happened. If she screamed, they were safe. If she remained silent, they had 72 hours to live. As the dashboard clock clicked to midnight, Sophia reached across Jake and pressed the horn 3 times. The sound echoed through the valley with unnatural resonance, as if the very air was amplifying the signal. Then came the waiting. Jake gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, while Destiny held her phone ready to record whatever happened next. Sophia stared intently at the empty space where the bridge should have been, her heart pounding so hard she was sure the others could hear it. At 12:01 a.m., the temperature inside the car dropped 20 degrees in an instant. Their breath became visible, and frost began forming on the windows despite the mild October weather. The creek below stopped babbling, as if the water itself was holding its breath. Then, in the space between the stone abutments, a figure began to materialize. She appeared slowly, like a photograph developing in a dark room, becoming more solid with each passing second. Catherine Mills was exactly as the witnesses had described her. A young woman in her early 20s, wearing a white dress that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Her dark hair hung in wet strands around her face, and her eyes held the kind of sadness that comes from decades of unwilling servitude to forces beyond comprehension. She stood on the invisible bridge as if the stone and steel were still there, her bare feet positioned precisely where the roadway would have been. For a moment, she simply stared at the 3 students, her expression unreadable. Then Catherine Mills opened her mouth, and the scream that emerged was unlike anything any of them had ever heard. It wasn't just loud, it was a sound that seemed to bypass the ears and strike directly at the soul. The car windows didn't just crack, they exploded inward, showering the students with safety glass. The scream contained layers of anguish, rage, and warning that spoke to something primal in the human psyche. It was the sound of every mother who had lost a child, every lover who had been betrayed, every innocent who had died before their time. But as the scream reached its crescendo, something went wrong. Catherine Mills' expression changed from sorrowful warning to confused terror. She looked down at her feet, then back at the students, and her mouth opened again. This time, no sound emerged. She was trying to scream, desperately attempting to voice the warning that would save their lives. But she had been silenced by some force more powerful than her own ghostly will. Jake didn't wait to see what happened next. He threw the car into reverse and floored the accelerator, sending gravel flying as they backed away from the bridge site. In the rearview mirror, they could see Catherine Mills still standing on her invisible bridge, her mouth open in a silent scream, her arms reaching toward them in desperate supplication. She was trying to warn them, but something was preventing her from doing so. The drive back to campus was conducted in terrified silence. None of them spoke about what they had witnessed until they reached Jake's dorm room, where they sat in stunned contemplation of what the silent scream might mean. Sophia's research had been clear. If Catherine Mills appeared but remained silent, death was inevitable within 72 hours. But what they had witnessed was different. She had tried to scream, had been prevented from screaming, which suggested that whatever force controlled her had decided their fate independently of her usual judgment. Over the next 3 days, the students tried to maintain normal routines while living under the shadow of impending doom. Jake became obsessively cautious, checking and rechecking every mechanical system in his car, avoiding stairs, elevators, and anything that might be considered remotely dangerous. Destiny threw herself into research, trying to find some scientific explanation for what they had experienced, some way to rationalize the impossible. Sophia delved deeper into the legend, searching for any precedent, any case where Catherine Mills had been silenced and what it might mean. On the third night, at exactly 12:03 a.m., 72 hours after their encounter, Destiny Kim simply vanished. She was in her dorm room, video chatting with her parents in California. When the call abruptly ended, her roommate found the room empty, with no signs of struggle, no indication of how she had left. The window was still locked from the inside, the door had been closed, and security cameras showed no one entering or leaving the building. Destiny Kim had simply ceased to exist, as if she had been erased from reality itself. The police investigation turned up nothing. Destiny's disappearance was classified as a missing person case, but no trace of her was ever found. Jake and Sophia knew the truth, but they also knew that no one would believe them. They had witnessed something that existed outside the normal rules of life and death, and they had paid the price for their curiosity. The legend of the Susquehanna Screamer had claimed another victim, but this time the method was different, more personal, more cruel. Sophia never completed her thesis on supernatural folklore. She changed her major to accounting and moved to Arizona after graduation, as far from Pennsylvania as she could get. Jake developed severe anxiety and depression, requiring years of therapy to function normally. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, both of them swear they can still hear Catherine Mills trying to scream, still attempting to deliver the warning that might have saved their friend's life. The bridge site on Susquehanna Road remains empty, the stone abutments standing like sentinels over a creek that runs red on certain nights. Local authorities have installed barriers to prevent cars from approaching the location. But they can't barrier the past. And they can't silence the screams that echo through the valley whenever someone is foolish enough to honk their horn 3 times at midnight. Because some warnings come too late, and some protectors are more dangerous than the threats they guard against. Let's move to our third story. And this one will show you that some claims to the land run deeper than any deed or title, extending far beyond the grave itself. We're heading to California's Sierra Nevada mountains, where Prospector's Road winds through what was once the heart of gold rush country. This isn't the romanticized version of the 1849 gold fever that you see in movies. This is about the brutal reality of men who killed for a handful of dust and died protecting claims that weren't worth the blood spilled over them. But death doesn't always end a miner's work, and some prospectors never stopped digging, never stopped defending what they believed was rightfully theirs. Park Ranger Vincent Caldwell had been patrolling the remote sections of the Sierra National Forest for 15 years, and he thought he'd seen everything these mountains had to offer. Vincent was a practical man, former military, who approached his job with methodical precision and an appreciation for the historical significance of the territory under his protection. The stretch of Prospector's Road that fell under his jurisdiction was a narrow, winding dirt track that connected several abandoned mining sites from the 1850s places where fortunes had been made and lost, where men had lived and died in pursuit of gold that had long since been extracted from the earth. Dr. Rebecca Santos was a historian from UC Berkeley, specializing in gold rush-era labor disputes and mining claim conflicts. She had requested permission to conduct research in the remote sections of the forest, specifically focusing on a series of violent incidents that had occurred along Prospectors Road between 1851 and 1853. Her research had uncovered evidence of at least 12 murders related to claim jumping and territorial disputes, most of them never officially investigated by the sparse law enforcement of the era. Rebecca was particularly interested in the case of Jeremiah Thorne, a prospector who had been found shot to death in 1852. His body discovered 3 days after he'd been killed, still clutching a pickaxe and positioned as if he'd been defending his claim even in death. On September 23, 2022, Vincent was conducting his weekly patrol of Prospectors Road when he encountered Dr. Santos at the Thorne claim site, about 8 miles from the nearest paved road. She had set up a small research station with surveying equipment, metal detectors, and historical documents spread across a folding table. The location was marked by a few rotting wooden posts and a rusted sign that read, "Thorne's Luck, established 1851. But there was something about the place that had always made Vincent uncomfortable. The vegetation grew differently here, stunted and sparse, as if the soil itself was poisoned by old violence. Dr. Santos explained her research to Vincent as they walked the boundaries of the original claim. According to her documents, Jeremiah Thorne had discovered a particularly rich vein of gold in the creek that ran through this section of the mountain. He'd filed his claim legally and worked it alone for nearly a year, accumulating what contemporary accounts suggested was a substantial fortune in gold dust and nuggets. But Thorne was paranoid, convinced that other miners were planning to jump his claim, and he'd taken to sleeping on the site with a loaded rifle and a reputation for shooting first and asking questions later. The murder had occurred on a foggy October morning in 1852. 3 men, claimed jumpers from a camp downstream, had approached Thorne's site before dawn, intending to kill him and take over his operation. But Thorne had been waiting for them. The gunfight that followed left all 4 men dead, with Thorne managing to kill his 3 attackers before succumbing to his own wounds. His body was found days later by a passing prospector, still gripping his pickaxe, positioned over the entrance to his mine shaft as if guarding it even in death. What made the case particularly interesting to Dr. Santos was what happened afterward. Every attempt to work Thorne's claim had ended in disaster. The 3 men who tried to take over the site in 1853 were found dead of apparent heart attacks, despite being young and healthy. A mining company that purchased the claim in 1854 lost 5 workers in a series of accidents, cave-ins, equipment failures, and unexplained falls before abandoning the operation. By 1860, the site had gained such a sinister reputation that no one would work it, and it had remained untouched ever since. As Vincent and Dr. Santos discussed the historical significance of the site, they began to notice something strange. The forest around them had gone completely silent. No bird songs, no insect buzzing, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. The temperature had dropped noticeably despite the afternoon sun, and there was a smell in the air that Vincent couldn't identify. Something metallic and organic, like old blood mixed with fresh earth. Dr. Santos was taking photographs of the claim markers when she stopped suddenly, her camera frozen halfway to her face. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Vincent strained his ears, and then he heard it too. A rhythmic tapping sound, like metal striking stone, coming from somewhere beneath their feet. The sound was faint but persistent, following a pattern that suggested deliberate, methodical work. It was the unmistakable sound of a pickaxe biting into rock. But there was no one else in the area, and the nearest active mining operation was over 50 miles away. The tapping continued for several minutes, growing gradually louder and more insistent. Vincent checked his radio, thinking the sound might be some kind of interference, but the device was silent. Dr. Santos had gone pale, her academic composure cracking as she realized that her historical research was becoming a very real and present danger. The sound seemed to be moving, following the old creek bed that ran through Thorne's claim, as if someone was working their way along the original vein of gold. Then came the voice, a harsh whisper that seemed to emerge from the very ground beneath their feet. "Get off my claim." The words were clear and unmistakable, spoken with the kind of authority that comes from absolute conviction. Vincent's hand instinctively moved to his service weapon. But what could he arrest? What could he shoot? The voice came again, louder this time, with an edge of violence that made both researchers step backward. "This is my gold, my claim, my mountain." Dr. Santos tried to maintain her scientific objectivity, pulling out a digital recorder and attempting to document what they were experiencing. But as she raised the device, the tapping sound stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt oppressive. The air grew thick and heavy, as if a storm was approaching, but the sky remained clear. Then, from the direction of the old mine shaft, came the sound of footsteps. Heavy boots on rocky ground, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Vincent grabbed Dr. Santos by the arm and began backing toward their vehicles. But the footsteps followed them, maintaining a constant distance of about 20 feet. They couldn't see anyone, but they could hear the crunch of gravel, the scrape of metal against stone, and something else. Labored breathing, as if whoever was following them was carrying a heavy burden. The smell of old blood grew stronger, mixed now with the acrid scent of gunpowder and something that reminded Vincent of his military days, the unmistakable odor of violent death. As they reached Vincent's Ranger vehicle, Dr. Santos made a crucial mistake. She turned to look back at the claim site, and what she saw made her scream. Standing among the rotting claim posts was the figure of a man. Tall, gaunt, wearing the rough clothes of a 1850s prospector. His face was partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but they could see enough to know that this was not a living person. His skin had the gray pallor of old corpse, and there were dark stains across his chest that could only be dried blood. In his hands, he carried a pickaxe that gleamed with an unnatural light, as if it had been forged from something other than ordinary steel. The phantom prospector raised his pickaxe and pointed it directly at Dr. Santos, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the distance with supernatural clarity. "You want to know about my claim? You want to dig up my secrets? Then stay and work. Stay and dig. Stay and die like the others." The figure began walking toward them, not with the shambling gait of a movie zombie, but with the determined stride of a man who had work to finish and wouldn't be deterred by something as trivial as death. Vincent didn't wait to see what would happen next. He shoved Dr. Santos into the passenger seat of his vehicle and gunned the engine, sending gravel flying as they raced down Prospector's Road toward the main highway. In his rearview mirror, he could see the phantom prospector standing in the middle of the road, still pointing his pickaxe in their direction, growing smaller, but somehow no less menacing as the distance increased. They drove in silence for the first 10 miles, both trying to process what they had experienced. Dr. Santos was the first to speak, her voice shaky but determined. "We have to go back. This is the discovery of a lifetime. Documented evidence of post-mortem consciousness, of territorial behavior extending beyond biological death." But Vincent was already shaking his head. He'd seen enough combat to recognize a threat when he encountered one, and everything about Jeremiah Thorne's phantom screamed danger. When they reached the ranger station, Vincent filed a report recommending that the Thorne claim site be declared off-limits to researchers and hikers. He cited unstable ground conditions and potential environmental hazards, but he knew the real reason. Some places were meant to remain undisturbed. Some claims were still being worked by miners who would never accept that their time was over. Dr. Santos returned to Berkeley and tried to organize a follow-up expedition, but she found it impossible to recruit volunteers. Word had spread through the academic community about her experience on Prospector's Road, and while some colleagues expressed interest in her findings, none were willing to risk a personal encounter with Jeremiah Thorne's ghost. Her research remained incomplete, her evidence dismissed as stress-induced hallucination by skeptical peers. But Vincent continued his patrols of the area, and over the following months, he documented a pattern of strange incidents. Hikers reported hearing pickaxe sounds and whispered warnings to stay away. Metal detectorists found their equipment malfunctioning in specific areas around the old claim. Most disturbing of all, 3 separate individuals who ignored the posted warnings and attempted to explore the Thorne site were found unconscious, with no memory of what had happened to them, but bearing strange marks on their hands, calluses and cuts consistent with prolonged use of mining tools. Vincent realized that Jeremiah Thorne wasn't just defending his claim anymore. He was recruiting workers, trying to force the living to complete the work that death had interrupted. The phantom prospector had found a way to continue his mining operation using unwilling laborers who had no choice but to dig until they collapsed from exhaustion or worse. The Thorne claim site remains officially closed to the public, marked with warnings about unstable ground and environmental hazards. But Vincent knows the truth, and on quiet nights when he's patrolling the remote sections of Prospector's Road, he can still hear the sound of pickaxe striking stone, still smell the mixture of blood and gunpowder that marks Jeremiah Thorne's eternal claim. Because some men never stop working, never stop defending what they believe is theirs. And death is just another shift change in a mine that never closes. Let's move to our 4th story. And this one will challenge everything you think you know about time, death, and the thin line between helping someone and becoming their victim. We're traveling to the desolate stretch of Route 2A that cuts through Maine's Haynesville woods, a place where the trees grow so thick they block out the sun even at midday, and where the winter cold can kill you in minutes if your car breaks down. This is a road where good Samaritans go to die, where acts of kindness become invitations to something far more sinister than a simple ghost story. Insurance adjuster Daniel Reeves had been driving Route 2A for 12 years, making his monthly rounds to assess claims in the remote communities scattered throughout Washington County. Daniel was the kind of man who took pride in his reliability, punctual, methodical, and genuinely concerned about the people whose lives had been disrupted by accidents, fires, and natural disasters. He'd helped countless families navigate the bureaucratic maze of insurance claims, often going above and beyond his job requirements because he understood that behind every file number was a human being in crisis. On February 14th, 2023, Daniel was driving home from a particularly difficult case, a house fire that had left a young family homeless just before Valentine's Day. The temperature had dropped to -15 degrees, and a winter storm was moving in from the north, turning the already treacherous mountain road into a sheet of black ice. Daniel's Ford Explorer was equipped with snow tires and four-wheel drive. But he knew that Route 2A in winter conditions was dangerous, even for experienced drivers. The road had claimed dozens of lives over the years, earning it the nickname Death's Highway among locals who avoided it whenever possible. At 11:47 p.m., just as the first heavy snowflakes began to fall, Daniel's headlights illuminated a figure standing beside the road near mile marker 23. It was a woman, appearing to be in her mid-20s, wearing a thin white dress that was completely inappropriate for the brutal weather conditions. She wasn't waving or trying to flag him down. She was simply standing there, perfectly still, as if waiting for something. Daniel's first instinct was concern. No one could survive more than a few minutes in that kind of cold wearing so little. And the nearest town was over 20 miles away. Daniel pulled over and rolled down his window, feeling the Arctic air bite at his face. "Miss, are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman turned toward him, and Daniel was struck by how beautiful she was. Pale skin that seemed to glow in his headlights, dark hair that hung in perfect waves despite the wind, and eyes that held a sadness so profound it made his chest ache. When she spoke, her voice was soft and melodic, with a slight accent that Daniel couldn't place. "I need a ride. My car broke down about 5 miles back, and I've been walking for hours." Daniel didn't hesitate. He unlocked the passenger door and gestured for her to get in. "Of course, climb in before you freeze to death. I'm Daniel, by the way." The woman slid into the passenger seat with fluid grace, and Daniel noticed that despite having supposedly been walking in sub-zero temperatures, she wasn't shivering, and her dress wasn't even damp from the snow. "Thank you so much," she said, settling into the seat. "I'm Claire Morrison." As Daniel pulled back onto Route 2A, he tried to make conversation to put his passenger at ease. "Where were you headed tonight? This isn't exactly the kind of road you want to be stranded on in winter." Claire stared out the windshield, her expression distant and melancholy. "I was going home. I've been away for so long, and I just wanted to go home." There was something in her voice that made Daniel glance at her more closely. In the green glow of the dashboard lights, her skin looked almost translucent, and he could swear he could see the seat fabric through her body. Daniel shook his head, attributing the optical illusion to fatigue and the stress of driving in dangerous conditions. "Where's home for you? I know this area pretty well. I might be able to get you close, even if it's off the main road." Claire turned to look at him, and her eyes seemed to reflect light like an animal's. "Haynesville. I lived there with my husband before." She trailed off, and Daniel noticed that her hands were folded in her lap, but he couldn't see them clearly. It was as if they were there, but not there. Present, but somehow insubstantial. The conversation continued as they drove deeper into the woods. But Daniel began to notice inconsistencies in Claire's story. She mentioned details about Haynesville that didn't match his knowledge of the area. Businesses that had closed decades ago, roads that had been rerouted, people who had died years before. when he gently corrected her about a restaurant she mentioned. Claire looked confused, as if she couldn't understand why her information was wrong. "But I was just there last week," she insisted. "The Blue Moon Diner, right on Main Street. Martha still makes the best apple pie in the county." Daniel knew that the Blue Moon Diner had burned down in 1987 and was never rebuilt. Martha Henley, the owner, had died in the fire. But something about Claire's certainty, the genuine confusion in her voice, made him reluctant to press the issue. Instead, he focused on driving, fighting the increasingly treacherous road conditions as the storm intensified. The snow was falling so heavily now that his wipers could barely keep the windshield clear, and the wind was howling through the trees with a sound like tortured souls. At 12:23 a.m., Claire suddenly became agitated. "Stop the car," she said urgently. "You need to stop the car right now." Daniel looked around but saw nothing that would require an emergency stop. "What's wrong? I don't see anything." Claire's voice rose to near panic. "Please, Daniel, you have to stop. There's going to be an accident. A terrible accident. I can see it happening." Her distress was so genuine that Daniel began to slow down. But as he did, Claire reached over and grabbed the steering wheel, yanking it hard to the right. The Explorer skidded off the road and came to rest against a snowbank, the engine stalling in the sudden silence. Daniel was about to demand an explanation when he heard it. The sound of screeching brakes and twisting metal from somewhere ahead on the road. Through the swirling snow, he could see the glow of headlights spinning wildly, followed by the sickening crunch of a vehicle hitting trees. Claire had somehow known that an accident was about to happen at the exact spot where they would have been if she hadn't forced him to stop. "How did you know?" Daniel asked, his voice barely a whisper. Claire turned to face him, and in the dim light, he could see tears streaming down her cheeks. "Because I've seen it before. I've seen it happen so many times, and I can never stop it. I can only save the ones who pick me up, the ones who show kindness to a stranger." Daniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold. "Claire, what are you talking about? Who are you, really?" Claire's form began to shimmer, becoming more translucent with each passing second. "I died on this road, Daniel. February 14th, 1987. My husband and I were driving home from dinner when we hit black ice at mile marker 28. Our car went off the road and rolled down the embankment. He died instantly, but I lived for 3 hours, trapped in the wreckage, calling for help that never came. I froze to death alone in the dark, and when I finally died, I couldn't let go. I couldn't leave this road." Daniel's hands were shaking as he reached for his phone to call for help for the accident ahead. But Claire continued her story. "Every night, I walk this road, looking for drivers who might suffer the same fate. When someone stops to help me, someone who shows the kindness that no one showed me, I try to save them from the accidents I can see coming. But there's a price, Daniel. There's always a price for cheating death." The phone in Daniel's hand showed no signal, which wasn't unusual in this remote area. But when he looked at the screen more closely, he noticed something that made his blood freeze. The date displayed was February 14th, 1987. Not 2023, but 1987. 36 years ago. "Claire," he said slowly, "what's the price? What happens to the people you save?" Claire's form was becoming more ethereal by the moment, her voice fading like an echo. "Time, Daniel. Time is the price. You can't cheat death without giving up something in return. I saved you from that accident. But now you're here with me, in my time, in my moment of death. You're trapped in February 14th, 1987, just like I am. You'll live this night over and over, helping me save other drivers until someone else takes your place. Daniel looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror and saw that his face was already beginning to change, becoming paler, more translucent. His warm breath was no longer fogging in the cold air, and he could feel his body temperature dropping to match the winter night. "How long?" he asked. "How long do I have to do this?" Claire's voice was barely audible now, a whisper carried on the wind. "Until someone else shows the same kindness you did. Until another good Samaritan stops to help a stranger on a cold night. Then you can rest, and they'll take your place." That's how it works, Daniel. That's how it's always worked. Daniel tried to start the Explorer, but the engine wouldn't turn over. And the fuel gauge showed empty, even though he'd filled the tank that morning. His phone was dead, the battery drained despite being fully charged when he'd left home. He was stranded on Route 2A in 1987, with no way to call for help, no way to get home, no way to escape the endless loop of February 14th. As the hours passed, Daniel began to understand his new existence. He would walk the road, appearing to drivers as a stranded motorist in need of help. Those who stopped, who showed kindness to a stranger, would be saved from accidents he could somehow foresee. But they would also be trapped, forced to take his place in the endless cycle of death and salvation that had claimed Claire Morrison 36 years ago. The first driver Daniel saved was a young woman named Sarah, who stopped to help him on what she thought was February 15th, 2023, but which was actually February 14th, 1987. He watched her face change from concern to confusion to horror as she realized what had happened to her. Then Sarah took his place, walking the road in search of the next Good Samaritan, while Daniel faded into the passenger seat of her car, becoming the hitchhiker who would guide the next victim to safety and damnation. Route 2A through Haynesville Woods remains one of Maine's most dangerous roads, with an unusually high number of accidents that are somehow avoided at the last second by drivers who report picking up hitchhikers who warn them of impending danger. The Maine State Police have investigated dozens of these reports, but they never find any evidence of the mysterious passengers who supposedly saved these drivers' lives. Daniel Reeves was reported missing on February 15th, 2023, when he failed to return home from his business trip. His Ford Explorer was found abandoned on Route 2A, but there was no sign of Daniel himself. The official investigation concluded that he had probably wandered into the woods and succumbed to exposure, but his body was never recovered. His family still holds out hope that he'll return someday, not knowing that he's still out there, still helping people, still trapped in an endless loop of kindness and consequence on the loneliest road in Maine. Let's move to our fifth story, and this one will prove that some mysteries are better left unsolved, that some phenomena exist beyond the boundaries of human understanding and should never be challenged by scientific inquiry. We're traveling to the border between Missouri and Oklahoma, where a stretch of rural highway known as the Devil's Promenade has been haunted by an unexplained light phenomenon for over a century. This isn't swamp gas or car headlights reflecting off atmospheric moisture. This is something that defies every law of physics, something that seems to possess its own malevolent intelligence and grows stronger with each attempt to study it. Dr. Amanda Torres was a quantum physicist from MIT, specializing in electromagnetic anomalies and unexplained energy phenomena. She had built her career on debunking supernatural claims through rigorous scientific methodology, and the Devil's Promenade light represented the kind of challenge she lived for. Amanda had studied the historical accounts dating back to 1881, when the first settlers reported seeing a mysterious orb of light dancing through the woods near Hornet, Missouri. The light appeared almost nightly, varying in size from a baseball to a basketball, glowing with an intensity that could be seen from miles away, but somehow never illuminated the surrounding landscape. What made the phenomenon particularly intriguing to Amanda was its consistency. Unlike most reported paranormal activity, the Devil's Promenade light followed predictable patterns. It appeared most frequently between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m., typically manifesting near the old railroad tracks that had been abandoned since the 1960s. The light would dance and weave through the trees, sometimes approaching observers before retreating, sometimes splitting into multiple orbs that moved in perfect synchronization. Hundreds of witnesses had described identical behaviors over the decades, suggesting that whatever was causing the phenomenon had remained unchanged for over a century. Billy Crow Feather was a local Quapaw tribal elder who had grown up hearing stories about the light from his grandfather, who had witnessed it as a young man in the 1920s. Billy understood that Dr. Torres represented everything his people had learned to fear about white academics. The arrogant assumption that science could explain and control forces that were meant to remain mysterious. When Amanda contacted him through the tribal council, requesting a guide for her research expedition, Billy initially refused. But something about her respectful approach and genuine scientific curiosity eventually convinced him to help, though he insisted on certain conditions. The light isn't just a phenomenon, Billy explained as they drove toward the research site on October 31st, 2022. It's a guardian, a protector of something that was buried here long before your people arrived. My grandfather called it the keeper of the deep places, and he warned that anyone who tried to capture it or study it too closely would face consequences that science couldn't explain or fix. Amanda listened politely, but her scientific training made her skeptical of supernatural explanations. She was convinced that the light was some form of piezoelectric phenomenon, possibly related to underground quartz deposits being compressed by seismic activity. Amanda had brought an impressive array of equipment: electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras, spectrometers, and a custom-built containment device that she believed could capture and analyze the light's energy signature. Her plan was to set up a perimeter of sensors around the most active area, then use focused electromagnetic pulses to interact with the phenomenon and determine its true nature. Billy watched her unpack the sophisticated instruments with growing unease, muttering prayers in his native language that Amanda assumed were simple cultural rituals. The first sign that something was wrong came at 9:47 p.m., when all of Amanda's electronic equipment began malfunctioning simultaneously. The electromagnetic field detectors started registering readings that were off the charts. The infrared cameras showed temperature fluctuations that defied thermodynamics, and the spectrometer began displaying wavelengths that didn't exist in any known spectrum. Amanda was thrilled rather than concerned. These anomalous readings suggested that she was on the verge of discovering something revolutionary, something that would rewrite the textbooks on electromagnetic theory. At 10:15 p.m., the light appeared. It started as a small, dim glow about 50 yards away, hovering just above the old railroad tracks. Amanda immediately began recording, her instruments capturing data at an unprecedented rate. The light seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, growing brighter and larger with each rhythmic expansion. But as Amanda watched through her equipment, she noticed something that made her scientific excitement turn to unease. The light wasn't just moving randomly. It was responding to her presence, to her instruments, as if it was aware of being studied. Billy had positioned himself at the edge of the clearing, far from Amanda's equipment array, and he was chanting softly in Quapaw. The light seemed to react to his voice, pulsing in rhythm with his words, and Amanda realized that there was some form of communication occurring between the tribal elder and the phenomenon. "Billy," she called out, "what are you saying to it?" But Billy didn't respond. His eyes had rolled back in his head, and he was speaking in a voice that didn't sound entirely his own. The light began to move closer, and Amanda's instruments registered energy levels that should have been impossible. The electromagnetic readings were so intense that her equipment should have been fried. But instead, it seemed to be drawing power from the phenomenon itself. The light was feeding her machines, giving them the energy they needed to study it, as if it wanted to be analyzed, wanted to be understood. Amanda was so focused on her data that she didn't notice the changes beginning to occur in her own body. At 11:23 p.m., the light suddenly expanded to the size of a small building, engulfing Amanda and her equipment in a brilliant white radiance that somehow cast no shadows. Inside the light, Amanda found herself in a place that existed outside normal space and time. She could see the history of the area unfolding around her. Native American burial grounds, Spanish conquistadors searching for gold, Civil War battles, and the construction of the railroad that had disturbed something ancient and powerful sleeping beneath the earth. The light wasn't just a phenomenon. It was a consciousness, an entity that had been awakened by human activity and had been trying to communicate for over a century. It showed Amanda visions of the deep places beneath the earth, caverns filled with crystalline formations that pulsed with their own inner light, chambers where time moved differently and the laws of physics were merely suggestions. The entity had been trying to warn people away from these places, trying to protect both the surface world and the realm below from the catastrophic consequences of their intersection. But Amanda's scientific instruments had done something unprecedented. They had created a bridge between the two realms, a conduit that allowed the entity to manifest more fully in the physical world. As the light poured into her equipment, Amanda felt it pouring into her as well, rewriting her cellular structure, transforming her from a human being into something that could exist in both dimensions simultaneously. The process was excruciating and ecstatic at the same time, like being torn apart and rebuilt at the molecular level. Billy's chanting grew more urgent, and Amanda realized that he was trying to perform some kind of cleansing ritual, attempting to sever the connection between her and the entity before the transformation became irreversible. But it was too late. The light had found what it had been searching for: a human consciousness sophisticated enough to understand its nature, someone who could serve as a permanent bridge between the worlds. Amanda felt her individual identity dissolving, becoming part of something vast and ancient and utterly alien. When the light finally receded at 2:17 a.m., Billy found Amanda standing motionless in the center of her destroyed equipment. Her eyes glowed with the same ethereal radiance as the phenomenon. And when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that no human throat could produce. "I understand now," she said. But the words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I can see the deep places, the chambers beneath the earth where time flows backward and light has weight. The entity isn't malevolent. It's trying to protect us from something much worse." Billy approached her carefully. recognizing the signs of spiritual possession that his grandfather had described. "Dr. Torres, you need to fight this. You need to remember who you are, remember your world." But Amanda shook her head, and the movement sent ripples of light through the air around her. "I can't go back, Billy. I've seen too much, become too much. The entity needs someone who can exist in both realms, someone who can stand guard at the threshold. That's my purpose now." Over the following weeks, Billy watched Amanda's transformation accelerate. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped engaging in any recognizably human behavior. Instead, she would stand in the woods near the old railroad tracks, her body glowing with increasing intensity, serving as a beacon for the entity that had claimed her. The Devil's Promenade light still appeared, but now it was accompanied by a second light, Amanda herself, transformed into a guardian of the deep places. The official investigation into Amanda's disappearance concluded that she had suffered some kind of psychological breakdown and wandered into the wilderness, where she presumably died of exposure. Her equipment was found destroyed by what appeared to be a massive electrical surge, and her research notes were filled with increasingly incoherent references to dimensional bridges and crystalline consciousness. The scientific community dismissed her final recordings as the ravings of a mind pushed beyond its limits by isolation and obsession. But Billy knew the truth, and he continued to visit the site regularly, bringing offerings and performing the protective rituals his grandfather had taught him. Sometimes, on clear nights when the moon was dark, he could see both lights dancing together through the trees, the ancient entity and its new human guardian, protecting the boundary between worlds that should never meet. The Devil's Promenade light continues to appear, but now it's accompanied by a second phenomenon that locals have begun calling the scientist's ghost. Visitors report seeing a woman in modern clothing standing among the trees, her body glowing with the same ethereal light as the original phenomenon. She doesn't interact with observers, but her presence seems to make the original light more active, more responsive to human presence. Dr. Amanda Torres was officially declared dead in 2023, but her transformation into something beyond human understanding continues in the deep places beneath the Missouri earth, where she serves as an eternal guardian of mysteries that science was never meant to solve. Let's move to our sixth story, and this one will show you that some childhood games should never be played, that some rituals open doors that can never be closed again. We're heading to Clinton Road in West Milford, New Jersey, a 10-mile stretch of asphalt that has earned the reputation as America's most haunted highway. This isn't just another ghost story. This is about the price of curiosity, about what happens when the living try to communicate with the dead through innocent games that are anything but innocent. Detective Lisa Moreau had been investigating missing persons cases in Passaic County for 8 years, and she thought she'd seen every kind of disappearance imaginable. Lisa was methodical, thorough, and had a reputation for solving cases that other detectives had given up on. She approached each investigation with the same systematic precision, following evidence wherever it led, no matter how strange or uncomfortable the truth might be. But the case of 17-year-old Kevin Walsh would challenge everything she thought she knew about the boundaries between life and death. Kevin Walsh was a typical suburban teenager. Good grades, played varsity soccer, had a part-time job at the local GameStop. He lived with his parents in a quiet neighborhood in West Milford, and by all accounts, he was a responsible kid who rarely got into trouble. But Kevin had one weakness that would prove fatal. He was fascinated by local legends and urban myths. particularly the stories surrounding Clinton Road. He'd spent hours researching the highway's dark history, collecting accounts of phantom vehicles, ghostly hitchhikers, and most intriguingly, the legend of the coin-throwing boy. According to the legend, there was a bridge on Clinton Road where a young boy had drowned in the 1960s. If you threw a coin into the water below the bridge at midnight, the dead boy would throw it back to you. It seemed like harmless fun, a classic example of teenage folklore designed to provide thrills without real danger. But Kevin's research had uncovered disturbing details that most people didn't know. The boy who had drowned wasn't just any child. He was Timothy Marsh, age 9, who had been murdered by his stepfather and thrown into the water to make it look like an accidental drowning. On November 3rd, 2022, Kevin convinced his girlfriend Sarah Chen and his best friend Marcus Rodriguez to accompany him to Clinton Road for what he called a scientific investigation of local folklore. Kevin had brought a digital camera, a voice recorder, and a bag of quarters for the coin-throwing ritual. He'd studied the timing carefully. They needed to arrive at the bridge at exactly 11:55 p.m., throw the coin at midnight, and wait for exactly 3 minutes. If the legend was true, Timothy Marsh would return the coin during that window. Detective Moreau learned these details from Sarah and Marcus during their interviews after Kevin's disappearance. Both teenagers described the same sequence of events with remarkable consistency, despite being questioned separately. They had parked Kevin's Honda Civic at the bridge around 11:50 p.m., and Kevin had immediately begun setting up his equipment. The night was unusually quiet. No traffic, no wind. Even the usual sounds of nocturnal wildlife seemed muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. At exactly midnight, Kevin threw a quarter into the dark water below the bridge. The coin made a small splash, and then silence returned to the area. For the first minute, nothing happened. Kevin stood at the bridge railing with his camera ready, while Sarah and Marcus waited by the car, both increasingly uncomfortable with the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to be building around them. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and their breath was visible in the suddenly frigid air. At 12:02 a.m., they heard a splash from below the bridge. Kevin's excitement was palpable as he leaned over the railing, shining his phone's flashlight into the water. "Something's down there," he whispered to his friends. "I can see ripples, but the water should be still." Sarah and Marcus approached the bridge reluctantly, and all three teenagers peered into the dark water below. The surface was indeed disturbed, with concentric circles spreading outward from a central point, as if something had just broken the surface. Then Kevin saw him. Standing in the water directly below the bridge was a small figure, a boy of perhaps 9 years old, wearing clothes that looked like they belonged to the 1960s. The child's skin was pale and waterlogged, and his eyes held an intelligence that seemed far too old for his apparent age. In his small hand, he held a coin that glinted in the moonlight. But instead of throwing it back up to the bridge, Timothy Marsh simply stood there, staring at Kevin with an expression of profound sadness mixed with something that looked like hunger. "He's not throwing it back," Kevin said, his voice barely audible. "He's just standing there, looking at me." Sarah grabbed Kevin's arm, trying to pull him away from the railing. "Kevin, we need to leave. This doesn't feel right." But Kevin was transfixed by the ghostly child below. He could see Timothy's mouth moving, as if the boy was trying to speak. But no sound reached the bridge. The dead child raised his free hand and beckoned to Kevin, a gesture that was both innocent and terrifying. What happened next would haunt Sarah and Marcus for the rest of their lives. Kevin began to climb over the bridge railing, moving with the mechanical precision of someone who was no longer in control of his own actions. "I need to go down there," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "He wants me to come down and get the coin myself." Sarah and Marcus grabbed him, trying to pull him back from the edge, but Kevin fought them with supernatural strength that his normal teenage frame shouldn't have possessed. During the struggle, Kevin's camera fell into the water below, but not before capturing several images that would later prove crucial to Detective Moreau's investigation. The photos showed Timothy Marsh standing in the water, but they also revealed something else. The ghostly boy wasn't alone. Surrounding him in the dark water were dozens of other figures, all children, all with the same waterlogged appearance and ancient eyes. They were reaching upward toward the bridge, their small hands grasping at the air as if trying to pull something down to join them. Kevin broke free from his friend's grip and jumped into the water below. Sarah and Marcus heard the splash, followed by Kevin's voice calling out in excitement, "I can see them all. There are so many of them down here." But when they shined their phone lights into the water, they saw only ripples spreading across the surface. Kevin had vanished completely, as if the water had swallowed him without a trace. Sarah immediately called 911, and within an hour, the area was swarming with emergency responders. Divers searched the water throughout the night. But the creek below the bridge was only 4 feet deep, not nearly deep enough for someone to drown, let alone disappear completely. The search expanded to include the surrounding woods, with tracking dogs and thermal imaging equipment. But no trace of Kevin Walsh was ever found. Detective Moreau took over the case the following morning, and her investigation revealed disturbing patterns that went back decades. The Clinton Road Bridge had been the site of numerous disappearances over the years, almost all involving teenagers who had come to perform the coin-throwing ritual. The official records showed these cases as runaways or accidental drownings, but Moreau's deeper investigation revealed that none of the bodies had ever been recovered, despite the shallow water and intensive search efforts. The photographs from Kevin's camera, recovered by divers, provided the most compelling evidence. The images showed not just Timothy Marsh, but an entire congregation of ghostly children standing in water that should have been too shallow to submerge them. Digital analysis revealed that the water in the photos appeared to be much deeper than the actual creek, as if the camera had captured a different reality than what existed in the physical world. Moreau's investigation led her to the historical records of Timothy Marsh's death in 1967. The boy had indeed drowned in the creek below the bridge. But the circumstances were far more sinister than the legend suggested. Timothy hadn't been murdered by his stepfather. He had been the victim of a serial killer who had targeted children throughout the 1960s. The killer had used the isolated location to dispose of at least 12 victims, all children between the ages of 8 and 12, all thrown into the water to make their deaths look accidental. The most disturbing discovery came when Moreau examined the timeline of disappearances. Every teenager who had vanished at the bridge had done so on the anniversary of one of the original murders. Kevin Walsh had disappeared on November 3rd, which was exactly 55 years after Timothy Marsh's death. The pattern suggested that the ghostly children weren't just returning coins. They were collecting replacements, drawing living teenagers into their underwater realm to join their eternal vigil. 3 weeks after Kevin's disappearance, Sarah Chen reported a disturbing encounter. She had been driving past the Clinton Road Bridge when she saw a figure standing on the railing. A teenager who looked exactly like Kevin. but with the same waterlogged appearance and ancient eyes as the ghostly children in the photographs. The figure had waved to her, and she could swear she heard Kevin's voice calling her name, inviting her to join him in the water below. Detective Moreau arranged for surveillance of the bridge, but the equipment malfunctioned every night at exactly midnight. Cameras would show static, audio recorders would capture only the sound of rushing water, and motion sensors would trigger without detecting any physical presence. The bridge had become a dead zone for technology, a place where the normal rules of physics and electronics no longer applied. The case of Kevin Walsh remains officially unsolved, classified as a missing person with no leads. But Detective Moreau knows the truth, and she's made it her mission to warn other teenagers away from Clinton Road. She's documented 17 similar disappearances over the past 40 years, all following the same pattern, all occurring at the bridge where Timothy Marsh and his fellow victims continue their eternal game of collecting coins and souls. The coin-throwing ritual at Clinton Road continues to attract curious teenagers, despite warnings from local authorities. But those who know the true history of the bridge understand that some games have rules that extend far beyond the living world, and some coins carry a price that can never be repaid. Because when you throw money into water where children have died, sometimes they decide to keep more than just your quarter. Let's move to our 7th story. And this one will prove that some roads are built on foundations of blood and greed, where the ghosts of the past refuse to let the living forget the sins that paved their way to prosperity. We're traveling to Arizona's legendary Route 66, specifically the treacherous stretch known as the Oatman Highway, where the desert heat can kill you during the day and the spirits of murdered miners hunt for justice in the darkness. This isn't just another roadside attraction ghost story. This is about viral fame built on tragedy, about content creators who discover that some stories are too dangerous to tell. Jessica Reeves was a travel blogger and social media influencer who had built her career on exploring America's forgotten places and abandoned towns. With over 2 million followers across her platforms, Jessica specialized in creating viral content about haunted locations, urban exploration, and the dark history hidden beneath America's tourist destinations. She approached each location with a mixture of genuine curiosity and calculated showmanship, understanding that her audience craved authentic experiences wrapped in compelling storytelling. The Oatman Highway represented the perfect combination of historical significance and supernatural intrigue that her followers demanded. Frank Delacroix was a retired history professor who had spent 30 years researching the mining boom and bust cycles of the American Southwest. After retiring from Arizona State University, Frank had become the unofficial historian of Oatman, a ghost town that had once been a thriving gold mining community, but was now little more than a tourist stop populated by wild burros and souvenir shops. Frank understood that the romanticized version of the Old West that tourists wanted to see was built on a foundation of violence, exploitation, and environmental destruction that most people preferred to ignore. On March 15, 2023, Jessica contacted Frank through the Oatman Historical Society, requesting a guided tour of the area for a documentary she was producing about America's most haunted ghost towns. Frank was initially reluctant to participate, having dealt with too many content creators who were more interested in sensationalism than historical accuracy. But Jessica's research impressed him. She had done her homework, studying the actual mining records, the labor disputes, and the suspicious deaths that had plagued the area during its boom years in the early 1900s. The story that fascinated Jessica most was that of Ezekiel Morrison, a prospector who had discovered one of the richest gold veins in the Oatman area in 1903. Morrison had filed his claim legally and worked it successfully for 3 years, accumulating what contemporary accounts suggested was a fortune worth millions in today's currency. But Morrison's success had made him enemies among the other miners and the corrupt officials who controlled the local mining operations. In 1906, Morrison was found dead in his mine shaft, officially ruled an accident caused by a cave-in. But witnesses reported seeing him arguing with 3 men the night before his death. What made Morrison's story particularly compelling was what happened after his death. Every attempt to work his claim had ended in disaster. Cave-ins, equipment failures, and mysterious accidents that killed or injured anyone who tried to extract gold from Morrison's mine. By 1910, the site had gained such a sinister reputation that no one would work it, and it remained abandoned even as other claims in the area continued to produce. Local miners began reporting sightings of Morrison's ghost, a tall figure in mining clothes who would appear at the entrance to his old claim, warning trespassers away with violent gestures. Jessica's plan was to spend 3 days in Oatman, documenting the town's history and exploring the abandoned mining sites, with Morrison's claim as the centerpiece of her investigation. She had brought professional camera equipment, drone technology for aerial footage, and sophisticated audio recording devices designed to capture electronic voice phenomena. Frank agreed to serve as her guide, but he insisted on certain conditions. They would respect the historical sites, avoid disturbing any artifacts, and maintain appropriate reverence for the people who had lived and died in the area. The first day of filming went smoothly, with Jessica creating engaging content about the town's history and the challenges faced by the miners who had worked the harsh desert environment. Frank proved to be an excellent interview subject, providing historical context and personal anecdotes that brought the past to life for Jessica's audience. But as they prepared to visit Morrison's claim on the second day, Frank noticed changes in the environment that made him increasingly uncomfortable. The desert around Morrison's claim was unnaturally quiet. No bird songs, no insect buzzing, no rustling of small animals in the scrub brush. The temperature seemed to fluctuate wildly, dropping from the normal March heat to an almost winter-like chill whenever they approached the mine entrance. Most disturbing of all, Jessica's electronic equipment began malfunctioning in ways that Frank had never seen before. Cameras would focus on empty air, as if tracking movement that wasn't visible to the human eye. And audio recorders would pick up sounds that resembled pickaxes striking stone, even though no one was working in the area. At 2:47 p.m., while Jessica was filming an introduction segment near the mine entrance, Frank noticed a shadow moving across the desert floor, a human-shaped silhouette that seemed to be cast by someone standing directly behind Jessica, even though no one was there. The shadow appeared in Jessica's camera footage, but when Frank looked at the actual location, he saw nothing but empty desert. Jessica was so focused on her presentation that she didn't notice the shadow mimicking her movements, growing darker and more defined with each passing minute. The first direct encounter occurred at 4:15 p.m., when Jessica was using her drone to capture aerial footage of the mining claim. The drone's camera began showing images that didn't match what they could see from the ground. Structures that had been demolished decades ago, mining equipment that had long since been removed, and most unnervingly, human figures moving around the site as if the mine was still in active operation. Frank recognized the clothing and equipment from historical photographs, realizing that the drone was somehow capturing images from the past, showing the mining claim as it had existed over a century ago. Jessica was thrilled by the anomalous footage, seeing it as the kind of viral content that would generate millions of views and establish her reputation as a serious paranormal investigator. But Frank was growing increasingly concerned about the intensity of the phenomena they were experiencing. In his 30 years of research, he had never encountered anything like the temporal distortions and electronic anomalies that seemed to be centered around Morrison's claim. At sunset, as they prepared to leave the site, Jessica made a decision that would prove fatal. She wanted to spend the night at the mining claim, believing that the paranormal activity would be more intense after dark. Frank strongly advised against this, explaining that the desert could be dangerous at night and that they had already documented enough material for her project. But Jessica was determined to capture footage of Morrison's ghost, convinced that a direct encounter would create the kind of viral content that would launch her career to the next level. Against Frank's better judgment, they set up camp near the mine entrance, with Jessica's cameras positioned to capture any supernatural activity that might occur during the night. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped dramatically, and the oppressive silence that had characterized the area during the day became even more pronounced. Jessica's equipment began registering electromagnetic anomalies that were off the charts, and her thermal cameras showed heat signatures moving around the campsite, even though no living beings were present. At 11:23 p.m., Ezekiel Morrison appeared. He materialized slowly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom, becoming more solid and defined with each passing second. Morrison was exactly as the historical accounts had described him. A tall, lean man in his 40s, wearing the rough clothes of a 1900s prospector, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent working in the harsh desert environment. But his eyes held a rage that had been building for over a century, and his presence radiated a malevolence that made both Jessica and Frank instinctively step backward. Morrison didn't speak, but his intentions were clear. He pointed directly at Jessica's cameras, then made a slashing gesture across his throat. The message was unmistakable. He wanted the filming to stop, wanted his story to remain untold, wanted the living to leave his claim undisturbed. But Jessica, driven by her desire for viral content and convinced that she was on the verge of documenting the paranormal encounter of a lifetime, continued filming. The ghost miner's response was swift and violent. Morrison raised his pickaxe and brought it down on Jessica's main camera, shattering the expensive equipment into pieces. But instead of stopping there, he turned his attention to Jessica herself, advancing on her with the same murderous intent that had characterized his interactions with claimed jumpers over a century ago. Frank grabbed Jessica's arm and began pulling her toward their vehicle. But Morrison moved with supernatural speed, positioning himself between them and their escape route. What happened next defied every law of physics that Frank understood. Morrison swung his pickaxe at Jessica, and although the ghostly tool passed through her body without causing physical harm, Jessica screamed and collapsed as if she had been struck by a real weapon. When Frank helped her to her feet, he saw that her eyes had changed. They now held the same ancient rage that burned in Morrison's ghostly gaze. And when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that no human throat could produce. "This is my claim," Jessica said, but the words seemed to come from Morrison himself, speaking through her body. "My gold, my mountain, my right to defend what's mine." Frank realized that Morrison hadn't just attacked Jessica. He had possessed her, using her body as a vessel to continue his eternal vigil over the mining claim that had cost him his life. The possession lasted for 3 hours, during which Jessica alternated between her normal personality and the vengeful spirit of Ezekiel Morrison. Frank watched in horror as she demonstrated knowledge of mining techniques and historical events that she couldn't possibly have known, speaking in the dialect and terminology of a 1900s prospector. When the possession finally ended at dawn, Jessica had no memory of what had occurred. But the experience had changed her in ways that would become apparent over the following weeks. Jessica's footage from that night was corrupted beyond repair, showing only static and distorted images that revealed nothing of the supernatural encounter they had experienced. But more disturbing was what happened to Jessica herself. She began experiencing blackouts during which she would find herself in remote desert locations with no memory of how she had gotten there. During these episodes, she would be discovered digging in the sand with her bare hands, searching for gold that existed only in Morrison's century-old memories. Frank tried to help Jessica understand what had happened to her, but she refused to believe that she had been possessed by a ghost. Instead, she attributed her experiences to stress and dehydration, continuing to pursue her content creation career despite the increasingly frequent blackouts and personality changes. But her followers began to notice differences in her videos. An obsession with mining history, references to events and people from the early 1900s, and a growing hostility toward anyone who questioned her research. The final video Jessica posted showed her returning to Morrison's claim alone, despite Frank's warnings and her own family's concerns about her mental state. The footage was discovered on her camera 3 days later, when search and rescue teams found her abandoned vehicle near the mine entrance. The video showed Jessica digging frantically at the mine entrance, muttering about claim jumpers and the need to protect her gold. The final frames captured her disappearing into the mine shaft, following a figure that the camera couldn't quite focus on, but that cast a shadow identical to Morrison's ghostly silhouette. Jessica Reeves was never found, despite extensive search efforts that included professional cave rescue teams and ground-penetrating radar. The official investigation concluded that she had become lost in the abandoned mine system and succumbed to dehydration or injury. But Frank knew the truth. Morrison had claimed another victim, adding Jessica to his eternal workforce of the possessed and the damned. The Oatman Highway continues to attract tourists and content creators, but Frank no longer serves as a guide for paranormal investigators. He's seen too much, learned too much about the price of disturbing the dead and exploiting tragedy for entertainment. Because some stories are too dangerous to tell, and some ghosts are too powerful to ignore, especially when they've had over a century to perfect their methods of claiming new victims for their endless golden obsession. Let's move to our 8th story. And this one will demonstrate that some acts of heroism transcend death itself. That the desire to protect others can be so powerful, it survives even the most brutal ending. We're traveling to the desolate railroad crossings of East Texas, where the ghost of a decapitated railroad worker continues his eternal vigil, saving lives while seeking justice for his own horrific murder. This isn't just another phantom railroad worker tale. This is about the price of standing up to corruption, about what happens when good men die for doing the right thing, and how their spirits refuse to rest until their work is finished. Train conductor Ray Gutierrez had been working the freight lines through East Texas for 19 years, and he thought he understood every mile of track, every crossing, every potential hazard that could threaten the massive cargo trains he helped guide through the rural landscape. Ray was a third-generation railroad man, following in the footsteps of his father and grandfather, who had taught him that the railroad was more than just a job. It was a sacred trust to move America's commerce safely and efficiently. He took pride in his perfect safety record, his attention to detail, and his reputation among younger workers as someone who could teach them how to survive in one of America's most dangerous professions. Maria Santos was a crossing guard who had been assigned to the remote intersection where County Road 47 crossed the main freight line about 15 miles outside of Marshall, Texas. Maria was new to the job, having been hired just 3 months earlier to replace the previous guard who had quit after reporting unusual incidents that the railroad company had dismissed as stress-related hallucinations. The crossing was notoriously dangerous. A blind curve on both the road and the rail line meant that drivers often couldn't see approaching trains until it was too late, and the freight trains couldn't stop in time to avoid collisions. On August 12, 2023, Ray was conducting his final training run with Maria, teaching her the proper protocols for managing the crossing during night operations when visibility was at its worst. The freight train they were escorting carried hazardous materials, tank cars filled with industrial chemicals that could create a catastrophic environmental disaster if derailed. Ray had emphasized to Maria that this particular crossing required extra vigilance, not just because of the dangerous cargo, but because of the crossing's history of fatal accidents. What Ray didn't tell Maria was the darker history of the crossing, the story that older railroad workers whispered about but never officially acknowledged. In 1987, a crossing guard named Thomas Mitchell had been murdered at this exact location, decapitated by unknown assailants who had made his death look like a railroad accident. Mitchell had been investigating safety violations and corruption within the railroad company, documenting evidence that certain crossings were being deliberately undermanned to save money, even though this policy was resulting in preventable deaths. The night of Mitchell's murder, he had discovered that someone was planning to sabotage the crossing signals, creating a situation that would cause a massive collision between a passenger train and a school bus returning from a late football game. Mitchell had tried to prevent the sabotage, but the conspirators had killed him and positioned his body on the tracks to make it appear that he had been struck by a train while performing his duties. The official investigation had concluded that Mitchell's death was an accident, but his headless ghost had been seen at the crossing ever since, continuing his work of protecting travelers from the dangers that corrupt officials refused to address. At 11:47 p.m., as Ray and Maria conducted their safety inspection of the crossing equipment, they noticed that the warning lights were malfunctioning. The signals that should have alerted drivers to approaching trains were flickering erratically, and the crossing gates were moving up and down without any apparent pattern. Ray immediately radioed the dispatcher to report the equipment failure, but the response was troubling. The control center showed all systems functioning normally, with no indication of any problems at the crossing. Maria was checking the signal mechanisms when she saw him first. A tall figure in a railroad uniform, standing about 50 yards down the track, holding a lantern that cast an unnaturally bright light in the darkness. The figure appeared to be waving the lantern in a specific pattern, the traditional railroad signal for danger ahead. But when Maria called Ray's attention to the mysterious flagman, Ray saw nothing but empty tracks stretching into the night. At 12:15 a.m., their radio crackled with an emergency transmission from the dispatcher. A passenger train carrying 200 people was approaching the crossing from the east, while a freight train loaded with propane tanks was approaching from the west. Due to a communication error, both trains had been given clearance to proceed through the crossing at the same time, setting up a collision that would kill hundreds of people and create an explosion that could be felt for miles. Ray immediately understood the magnitude of the disaster that was about to unfold. The passenger train couldn't stop in time, the freight train was too heavy to brake quickly, and the malfunctioning crossing signals meant that neither engineer would receive adequate warning of the approaching collision. Ray began running toward the crossing with emergency flares, hoping to signal both trains manually. But he knew that the distance and timing made success unlikely. That's when the headless flagman appeared to both of them. Thomas Mitchell materialized in the middle of the crossing, his railroad uniform from 1987 clearly visible in the moonlight. But where his head should have been, there was only empty space above his collar. In his hands, he carried a lantern that burned with supernatural intensity, casting light that seemed to penetrate the darkness far beyond what any normal flame could achieve. Mitchell began signaling with his lantern, using the traditional railroad codes that Ray recognized from his training. The ghost was communicating in the precise, professional language of railroad safety, indicating the positions of both approaching trains and the exact timing needed to prevent the collision. But Mitchell wasn't just providing information. He was taking action, moving with supernatural speed to manually operate the crossing equipment that had been sabotaged decades earlier. Ray watched in amazement as the headless flagman worked the crossing controls, somehow restoring power to the warning lights and lowering the crossing gates at precisely the right moment. The passenger train's engineer saw the signals and began emergency braking procedures, while the freight train received Mitchell's lantern signals and began reducing speed. But the ghost's work wasn't finished. He positioned himself directly on the tracks between the two approaching trains, his lantern held high, creating a beacon that both engineers could see from miles away. The collision was averted by less than 30 seconds. The passenger train stopped just short of the crossing, while the freight train managed to reduce its speed enough to pass safely through the intersection. 200 lives had been saved by the intervention of a railroad worker who had been dead for 36 years, a man whose dedication to safety had survived his own brutal murder. But as the immediate crisis passed, Ray realized that Thomas Mitchell's appearance had marked him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The headless flagman turned toward Ray and Maria, and although he had no face to express emotion, his body language conveyed a message that was both grateful and ominous. Mitchell had found someone who could see him, someone who understood the importance of his eternal vigil, and he wasn't going to let that connection go unused. Over the following weeks, Ray began experiencing visions of railroad accidents before they happened. He would see derailments, crossing collisions, and equipment failures in dreams that were so vivid they felt like memories. Each vision was accompanied by the image of Thomas Mitchell, the headless flagman pointing toward specific locations and times where Ray's intervention could prevent disasters. Ray realized that he had become Mitchell's partner in a supernatural safety program that operated outside the normal channels of railroad management. The first test came 3 weeks later, when Ray's visions showed him a school bus approaching a crossing where the warning signals had been deliberately disabled by someone who wanted to create an accident that would cover up evidence of safety violations. Ray arrived at the crossing just in time to manually operate the warning systems, saving 37 children from a collision that would have killed them all. But when Ray tried to report the sabotage to railroad officials, he found that his evidence had mysteriously disappeared, and his superiors seemed more interested in discrediting his story than investigating the safety violations. Ray began to understand the corruption that Thomas Mitchell had died trying to expose. The railroad company was systematically ignoring safety problems to save money. And when workers tried to report these violations, they faced harassment, termination, or worse. Mitchell's murder hadn't been an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of violence designed to silence anyone who threatened the company's profitable but deadly cost-cutting measures. Maria became Ray's ally in documenting the supernatural interventions that were preventing disasters throughout the East Texas rail system. She had developed the ability to see Thomas Mitchell's ghost, and she understood that their partnership with the headless flagsman was the only thing standing between the traveling public and a series of catastrophic accidents that corrupt officials were willing to allow in pursuit of higher profits. But their alliance with Mitchell came with a price. Ray began aging rapidly, as if his life force was being drained by his connection to the ghost. Maria experienced blackouts, during which she would find herself at remote crossings, manually operating safety equipment while having no memory of how she had gotten there. They were becoming extensions of Mitchell's will, human agents of a supernatural safety system that operated according to rules they didn't fully understand. The final confrontation came when Ray's visions revealed the ultimate goal of the corruption he had been fighting. Railroad executives were planning to stage a massive accident that would kill hundreds of people, but generate insurance payouts worth millions of dollars. The disaster would be blamed on equipment failure, but Ray knew that it was actually murder on an industrial scale, designed to enrich executives who viewed human lives as acceptable losses in their pursuit of profit. Ray and Maria tried to prevent the planned disaster through official channels, but they found themselves blocked at every turn by officials who were either corrupt or too intimidated to act. With no other options, they turned to Thomas Mitchell's ghost for help, asking the headless flagman to intervene directly in ways that living people could not. Mitchell's response was swift and terrifying. The executives responsible for planning the mass murder began experiencing accidents of their own. Car crashes, equipment failures, and mysterious incidents that left them dead or permanently disabled. The ghost had moved beyond preventing accidents to actively punishing those who caused them, using his supernatural powers to deliver the justice that the legal system had failed to provide. Ray realized that his partnership with Mitchell had transformed him into something more than human, but less than alive. He was becoming a ghost himself, bound to the railroad crossings of East Texas, destined to continue Mitchell's work long after his own death. The headless flagman had found his replacement, ensuring that the supernatural safety system would continue operating even after Mitchell's spirit finally found peace. The crossing where Thomas Mitchell died continues to operate under the protection of multiple ghosts. The original headless flagman and his growing team of human converts who have dedicated their afterlives to preventing the disasters that corporate greed makes inevitable. Because some jobs are too important to end with death, and some workers refuse to retire, even when retirement means eternal rest. Let's move to our 9th story. And this one will show you that sometimes the law enforcement that protects us in life continues its duty long after death, but not always with the same sense of justice we expect from the living. We're heading to the endless stretch of Interstate 80 that cuts through Nevada's high desert, where the Nevada Highway Patrol has been reporting encounters with a phantom police cruiser that appears to enforce laws that don't exist in any statute book, arresting drivers for crimes they haven't committed yet, and dispensing a form of justice that operates outside the boundaries of time itself. Captain Janet Cross had been with the Nevada Highway Patrol for 27 years, working her way up from rookie trooper to district commander through a combination of exemplary service and an intuitive understanding of the unique challenges posed by policing America's loneliest highways. Janet had seen everything the desert could throw at law enforcement. High-speed chases that ended in spectacular crashes, drug smugglers using the remote highways to transport their cargo, and the occasional tourist who wandered off the interstate and died of exposure in the unforgiving landscape. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for the reports that had been filtering in from her officers over the past 6 months. Officer Danny Park was a rookie fresh out of the academy, assigned to Janet's district for his field training. Danny was eager, intelligent, and possessed the kind of moral certainty that made him an ideal candidate for law enforcement. But he lacked the cynicism that comes with years of dealing with the worst aspects of human nature. Janet had chosen to personally oversee Danny's training because she recognized in him the same idealism that had driven her own career, and she wanted to ensure that his enthusiasm for justice wasn't crushed by the harsh realities of police work. On September 8, 2023, Janet and Danny were conducting a routine patrol of the I-80 corridor during the graveyard shift, the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. period, when the highway was at its most dangerous. The combination of long-haul truckers fighting fatigue, drunk drivers heading home from Reno casinos, and the hypnotic effect of driving through endless darkness made this stretch of road a magnet for fatal accidents. Janet was using the patrol as an opportunity to teach Danny about the subtle signs that indicated when a driver was impaired, distracted, or dangerous. At 2:17 a.m., their radio crackled with a dispatch call that immediately caught Janet's attention. Another highway patrol unit was requesting backup for a traffic stop near mile marker 127. But when Janet checked her computer system, there were no other units assigned to that sector. According to the duty roster, she and Danny were the only patrol car within 50 miles of that location. Janet radioed dispatch to clarify the situation, but the response was puzzling. Dispatch had no record of any other units in the area, and no backup requests had been logged. Danny suggested that they investigate the reported location, thinking that perhaps another unit had been diverted to their sector without proper notification. Janet agreed, but as they approached mile marker 127, she began to feel the kind of unease that comes from 27 years of police instincts warning her that something was fundamentally wrong. The highway was completely empty. No traffic, no parked vehicles, no sign of any police activity that would have generated a backup request. That's when they saw the patrol car. It was parked on the shoulder about a quarter-mile ahead, its emergency lights flashing in the distinctive pattern used by Nevada highway patrol vehicles. But as they drew closer, Janet noticed that something was off about the cruiser. It appeared to be an older model, possibly from the 1980s, with a paint scheme and equipment configuration that hadn't been used by the department in decades. The license plate was visible, but seemed to shimmer and change when viewed directly, as if the numbers and letters were constantly shifting. Janet pulled up behind the mysterious patrol car and activated her own emergency lights, following standard protocol for assisting another officer. But when she and Danny exited their vehicle, they found the other cruiser empty. The driver's door was open, the radio was crackling with static, and there was a clipboard on the front seat with what appeared to be a traffic citation in progress. The handwriting on the citation was clear and professional, but the violation codes didn't match any that Janet recognized from current Nevada traffic law. Danny approached the passenger side of the Phantom Cruiser and called out to Janet with excitement in his voice. "Captain, you need to see this. There's someone in the back seat." Janet moved to Danny's position and peered through the rear window of the patrol car. Sitting in the back seat, separated from the front by the standard prisoner transport barrier, was a man in his 30s wearing civilian clothes. He appeared to be unconscious or in some kind of trance, staring straight ahead with unfocused eyes. Janet tried the rear door and found it unlocked. The man in the back seat didn't respond to her voice or touch, but he was breathing normally and showed no signs of injury. When Janet checked his wallet for identification, she found a driver's license that made her blood run cold. The license belonged to Marcus Rivera, with an address in Reno and an issue date of September 15th, 2023. Exactly 1 week in the future. Before Janet could process the implications of finding a man with identification from the future, she heard Danny's voice calling from the front of the Phantom Patrol car. "Captain, the radio's picking up transmissions, but they're not coming from our dispatch." Janet listened to the radio chatter and realized that the communications were following proper police protocol. But the unit numbers, call signs, and incident codes were unlike anything used by the Nevada Highway Patrol. The radio crackled with a transmission that seemed to be directed at them. "Unit 247, this is Control. Suspect in custody for future violation of NRS 484B.653. Transport to temporal holding facility for processing." Janet grabbed the radio microphone and responded, "This is Captain Cross, Nevada Highway Patrol. Identify yourself and your jurisdiction." The response came immediately. "Unit 247. You are interfering with a lawful arrest. Suspect Rivera has been detained for vehicular homicide scheduled to occur on September 15th, 2023. Preventive detention authorized under Emergency Protocol 7. Danny looked at Janet with confusion and growing fear. "Captain, what's Emergency Protocol 7? I've never heard of preventive detention for future crimes." Janet hadn't heard of it either, but she was beginning to understand that they were dealing with something that operated outside normal law enforcement procedures. The Phantom Patrol car was apparently arresting people for crimes they were going to commit, using legal authorities that didn't exist in any jurisdiction, she knew. The situation became more surreal when the unconscious man in the back seat suddenly spoke, his voice flat and emotionless. "I didn't mean to kill them. The kids were crossing the street and I was texting, and I didn't see them until it was too late. But that's not supposed to happen until next week. How can I be arrested for something I haven't done yet?" Marcus Rivera was confessing to a crime that existed only in the future, describing events that hadn't occurred but apparently were destined to happen. Janet made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her career. She opened the rear door of the Phantom Patrol car and helped Marcus Rivera out of the vehicle. "Sir, you're not under arrest. Whatever you think you've done, it hasn't happened yet. And we're going to make sure it doesn't happen at all." But as soon as Marcus stepped out of the Phantom Cruiser, the vehicle began to fade, becoming translucent and insubstantial until it disappeared completely, leaving only the scent of motor oil and something that reminded Janet of ozone after a lightning strike. Marcus Rivera stood in the middle of Interstate 80, looking around in confusion as if he had just awakened from a deep sleep. When Janet questioned him about how he had gotten there, Marcus had no memory of being arrested or transported. The last thing he remembered was driving home from a bar in Reno. But when Janet checked the time, she realized that Marcus's last clear memory was from 3 hours in the future. Events that hadn't happened yet, but somehow had already been interrupted by his arrest. Janet and Danny transported Marcus to the nearest hospital for evaluation. But the medical examination revealed nothing unusual, except for a blood alcohol level that was exactly at the legal limit. Not enough to cause impairment, but exactly the amount that would be present if he had consumed alcohol at the rate and timing that would lead to the accident he had confessed to. Marcus was living in a state of temporal displacement, existing simultaneously in the present and the future that the Phantom Patrol car had prevented. Over the following weeks, Janet investigated similar reports from other highway patrol officers throughout Nevada. The Phantom Patrol car had been making arrests for future crimes, detaining drunk drivers before they got behind the wheel, stopping domestic abusers before they committed violence, and arresting drug dealers before they made their sales. In each case, the arrested individuals had no memory of their detention. But they also seemed to lose the motivation or opportunity to commit the crimes they had been destined to perform. Janet's investigation revealed that the Phantom patrol car belonged to Officer Robert Chen, a highway patrol trooper who had been killed in the line of duty in 1987. Chen had been investigating a drunk driving case when he was struck and killed by the same driver he had been trying to arrest. The official report stated that Chen had died, believing that he could have prevented the accident if he had acted sooner, if he had found a way to arrest the drunk driver before the crime was committed rather than after. The Phantom patrol car was Chen's spirit continuing his work, but with supernatural abilities that allowed him to see future crimes and prevent them through preemptive arrests. Chen had found a way to achieve perfect law enforcement, stopping crimes before they happened, protecting victims who didn't even know they were in danger. But his methods raised questions about free will, due process, and the nature of justice that Janet couldn't answer. Danny Park began experiencing visions of future crimes after his encounter with the Phantom patrol car. He would see accidents, assaults, and robberies before they happened, and he felt compelled to intervene, even though he had no legal authority to arrest people for crimes they hadn't committed yet. Janet realized that Danny was being recruited by Officer Chen's ghost, being prepared to join the supernatural law enforcement system that operated outside normal legal constraints. The final encounter occurred when Janet received a radio transmission from the Phantom patrol car, directing her to arrest Danny Park for future violation of oath of office and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Janet realized that Chen's ghost had determined that Danny would eventually become corrupt, that his idealism would be replaced by cynicism and criminal behavior. The Phantom patrol car was preparing to arrest Danny for crimes he would commit years in the future, removing him from law enforcement before he could betray his oath. Janet refused to cooperate with the Phantom arrest, but she watched helplessly as Danny began to change. His personality became flat and emotionless. His decision-making process seemed to operate according to logic that prioritized crime prevention over constitutional rights. And his reports began to describe arrests and interventions that had no basis in normal police procedure. Danny was becoming an agent of the Phantom patrol car, a living officer who could make arrests in the present based on crimes that would occur in the future. Captain Janet Cross retired from the Nevada Highway Patrol 6 months later, unable to reconcile her oath to uphold the law with the supernatural justice system that was operating on her highways. But she continued to monitor police reports from Interstate 80, documenting cases where officers reported assistance from mysterious backup units that dispatch had no record of sending. Because some cops never stop working their beat, even when their beat extends into dimensions where crime and punishment operate according to rules that the living were never meant to understand. The Phantom patrol car continues to operate on Interstate 80, making arrests for future crimes and recruiting living officers to join its supernatural law enforcement system. Because in the endless desert of Nevada, where time moves differently and justice operates outside normal legal boundaries, some cops have found a way to achieve perfect crime prevention by arresting criminals before they become criminals and protecting victims before they know they need protection. Let's move to our 10th story. And this one will prove that some places exist outside the normal flow of time, where the same tragedy plays out night after night in an endless loop of death and resurrection that traps both the living and the dead in a cycle of horror that can never be broken. We're traveling to Highway 50 in Nevada, known as the loneliest road in America, where a 24-hour diner serves the same customers the same meals at the same time every night, and where the staff has been working the same shift for over 60 years without aging a single day. Carol Brennan had been working as a waitress at the Midnight Diner for what felt like an eternity, though she could only clearly remember the events of one specific night. October 23rd, 1962. Carol was a practical woman in her mid-30s, the kind of person who took pride in remembering every customer's order, keeping the coffee fresh and maintaining the kind of cheerful efficiency that made truck drivers and late-night travelers feel welcome in the middle of nowhere. The diner was her domain, a small island of warmth and light in the vast darkness of the Nevada desert. And she treated every customer like family. Pete Kowalski was a regular at the diner, a long-haul trucker who made the run from San Francisco to Denver twice a month and always stopped at the Midnight Diner for coffee and pie around 11:30 p.m. Pete was a quiet man in his 50s, the kind of driver who kept to himself but always left generous tips and treated the staff with respect. He had been making the same stop for years, ordering the same meal, black coffee, apple pie, and a ham sandwich, and sitting in the same booth by the window where he could keep an eye on his rig in the parking lot. Eddie Vance was the night cook, a thin man in his 40s who had worked at the diner for as long as anyone could remember. Eddie was efficient and professional, able to prepare any item on the menu with the kind of speed and precision that came from years of practice. He rarely spoke to customers, preferring to focus on his work, but he had a reputation for never making mistakes and always having orders ready exactly when they were needed. Eddie understood the rhythm of the night shift, the ebb and flow of customers that followed predictable patterns. On what Carol believed was October 23, 1962, the diner was experiencing its usual late-night routine. The neon sign outside cast its familiar red glow across the empty highway. The coffee pot was full and fresh, and the pie case was stocked with Eddie's homemade desserts. Carol was wiping down the counter when she noticed something that had been bothering her for what felt like months. Every night seemed exactly the same, with the same customers arriving at the same times, ordering the same meals, and leaving at the same moments. At 11:15 p.m., the bell above the door chimed as the first customer of the night entered. It was Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who always ordered tea and toast, sat in the corner booth, and left exactly 37 minutes later. Carol served her with practiced efficiency, but as she poured the tea, she noticed that Mrs. Henderson's hands looked exactly the same as they had the night before, and the night before that. No changes in the liver spots, no variation in the way she held her cup, no difference in the quiet humming she did while eating. At 11:32 p.m., Pete Kowalski pushed through the door, his timing as precise as always. He nodded to Carol, took his usual booth, and waited for her to bring his coffee without having to order. But tonight, Carol decided to test something that had been nagging at her subconscious. "Evening, Pete. The usual?" she asked. But instead of bringing him black coffee, she poured cream into the cup. Pete didn't seem to notice the difference, drinking the coffee as if it was exactly what he had expected, even though Carol knew he never took cream. At 11:45 p.m., a young couple entered the diner. Tommy and Susan, who always ordered milkshakes and shared a piece of chocolate cake. They sat in the same booth, had the same conversation about their plans to get married, and left the same 25-cent tip. Carol had heard their conversation hundreds of times, word for word, gesture for gesture, and she was beginning to realize that she wasn't just experiencing déjà vu. She was reliving the same night over and over again. Eddie seemed oblivious to the repetitive nature of their existence, cooking the same orders with the same timing, cleaning the same dishes, and restocking the same supplies. But when Carol tried to talk to him about her growing suspicions, Eddie would respond with the same phrases he always used, as if he was reading from a script that never changed. Carol began to understand that she was the only one who retained any awareness of the endless repetition, the only one who could see the prison they were all trapped in. At 12:47 a.m., the event that defined their eternal night began to unfold. 3 men entered the diner, rough-looking characters in leather jackets who immediately made Carol uncomfortable. The leader was a tall man with cold eyes and a scar across his left cheek, flanked by 2 smaller men who moved with the nervous energy of career criminals. Carol had served them hundreds of times, and she knew exactly what was going to happen next. But she seemed powerless to change the outcome. The men ordered coffee and pie, but Carol could see the tension building in their body language. They were casing the diner, planning something violent, and Carol's growing awareness of the time loop allowed her to see details she had missed in previous iterations. The leader kept checking his watch. The man on his left had a gun bulge under his jacket, and the third man was positioning himself to block the exit. They weren't just customers. They were robbers preparing to commit a crime that would end in tragedy. At 1:15 a.m., the robbery began. The leader pulled a gun and demanded that Carol empty the cash register, while his accomplices threatened the other customers. Pete tried to intervene, reaching for something in his jacket. But the second gunman shot him before he could draw whatever weapon he was carrying. Mrs. Henderson screamed and tried to run, but the third robber caught her and threw her to the ground with such force that Carol heard her neck snap. Eddie emerged from the kitchen with a shotgun, but the leader was ready for him. The gunfight that followed was brief and brutal, with Eddie managing to wound one of the robbers before being shot multiple times. Carol tried to hide behind the counter, but the leader found her and shot her in the chest, the bullet tearing through her heart and killing her instantly. The young couple, Tommy and Susan, were executed as witnesses, their dreams of marriage ending in a pool of blood on the diner floor. But instead of dying, Carol found herself back behind the counter at 11 p.m., wiping down the same surface, preparing for the same customers, living through the same night that would end in the same massacre. She tried to change things, warning the customers, calling the police, even attempting to leave the diner. But every action she took seemed to lead to the same inevitable conclusion. The robbers would arrive, the violence would unfold, everyone would die, and the night would begin again. Over countless repetitions, Carol began to understand the rules of their supernatural prison. The diner existed in a temporal loop created by the violent emotions and unfinished business of that terrible night in 1962. Everyone who died in the massacre was trapped in the endless repetition, forced to relive their final hours without the ability to change the outcome. But Carol's growing awareness suggested that there might be a way to break the cycle, if she could find the key to their supernatural imprisonment. Carol discovered that she could retain memories and awareness between loops, while the others remained locked in their scripted behaviors. She began experimenting with small changes, moving objects, altering conversations, trying to disrupt the precise timing that led to the massacre. But every attempt to prevent the tragedy seemed to make it worse, as if the loop was designed to resist change and punish those who tried to escape. The breakthrough came when Carol realized that the robbery wasn't random. It was connected to something larger, a conspiracy that involved corrupt officials and organized crime. Pete wasn't just a truck driver. He was an undercover federal agent investigating a smuggling operation that used the diner as a way station. The robbers had been sent to eliminate him and destroy evidence that could expose their criminal network. The massacre wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. It was a planned execution disguised as a random crime. Carol began using her awareness to gather information during each loop, piecing together the conspiracy that had led to their deaths. She discovered that Eddie had been forced to cooperate with the smugglers, that Mrs. Henderson had witnessed something she shouldn't have seen, and that Tommy and Susan had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Everyone in the diner that night had been marked for death, and the loop was designed to ensure that their secrets died with them. The final revelation came when Carol realized that she wasn't just a witness to the massacre. She was the key to breaking the loop. Her growing awareness and ability to retain memories between repetitions meant that she could expose the conspiracy that had led to their deaths. But doing so would require her to sacrifice her existence in the loop, to give up the strange immortality that kept her consciousness intact in exchange for the chance to reveal the truth. Carol made her choice during what she hoped would be the final repetition of October 23rd, 1962. Instead of hiding behind the counter when the robbers arrived, she confronted them with the knowledge she had gained through countless loops. She named their real employers, revealed the details of the smuggling operation, and exposed the corruption that had led to the massacre. The robbers were so shocked by her impossible knowledge that they hesitated, giving Pete the chance to complete his mission and Eddie the opportunity to defend his customers. The loop shattered like glass, and Carol felt herself dissolving as the supernatural prison collapsed around her. The last thing she saw was the diner fading into the Nevada desert, taking with it the endless repetition of tragedy and death that had defined her existence for over 60 years. The Midnight Diner had finally closed, and its staff had finally been allowed to rest. Highway 50 through Nevada remains one of America's loneliest roads, but travelers no longer report seeing the neon sign of the Midnight Diner glowing in the desert darkness. The building that once housed the restaurant has been abandoned for decades, but sometimes, on clear nights when the moon is dark, drivers claim to see lights in the windows and smell coffee brewing in the empty structure. Because some places exist outside normal time, and some tragedies are too powerful to be contained by death, creating loops of horror that can only be broken by those brave enough to sacrifice everything for the truth. The Midnight Diner massacre remains officially unsolved, but Carol Brennan's sacrifice ensured that the truth would eventually surface, that justice would be served, and that the endless cycle of death and repetition would finally come to an end. Some waitresses never stop serving their customers, even when service means giving up their own existence to protect others from the horrors that lurk in the spaces between time and eternity. Let's move to our final story, and this one will reveal the terrifying truth that connects every haunted highway in America. That all roads lead to the same dark destination, and some journeys were never meant to end. We're returning to the research of Dr. Samuel Wright, a paranormal investigator who spent his entire career documenting supernatural phenomena along America's highways, only to discover that he had been manipulated from the very beginning by an ancient entity that had been using him to complete a ritual that would merge our world with something far more sinister. Dr. Samuel Wright had dedicated 43 years of his life to studying paranormal activity along America's highway system, documenting over 2,000 supernatural encounters from coast to coast. Samuel was a methodical researcher, approaching each case with scientific rigor while maintaining an open mind about phenomena that defied conventional explanation. His database contained detailed reports from Route 491's Phantom Trucker, Pennsylvania's Screaming Bridge, California's Gold Rush Phantom, Maine's vanishing hitchhiker, Missouri's devil light, New Jersey's coin-throwing boy, Arizona's mining ghost, Texas's headless flagman, Nevada's phantom patrol car, and the temporal loop of the midnight diner. What Samuel didn't realize until it was too late was that his research wasn't random academic curiosity. It was a carefully orchestrated plan that had been guiding his work for decades. Each case he investigated, each witness he interviewed, each piece of evidence he collected was part of a larger pattern that he was helping to complete. The entity that had been manipulating him was ancient beyond human comprehension, a consciousness that existed in the spaces between dimensions and fed on the psychic energy generated by human suffering and death. On Halloween night 2023, Samuel was reviewing his life's work in his study, surrounded by filing cabinets filled with witness statements, photographs, audio recordings, and maps that showed the locations of every supernatural encounter he had documented. As he spread the maps across his desk, Samuel noticed something that made his blood run cold. When he connected the locations of the most significant hauntings with red lines, they formed a perfect pentagram across the entire United States, with each point representing a gateway between our world and something that existed in the darkness beyond human understanding. The Phantom Trucker of Route 491 marked the western point of the pentagram, his eternal journey serving as a guardian of the dimensional barrier. The Screaming Bridge in Pennsylvania represented the eastern point, where Catherine Mill's silenced warnings had weakened the boundary between life and death. California's Gold Rush Phantom held the southwestern position, his territorial rage creating a vortex of violent energy. Maine's vanishing hitchhiker controlled the northeastern point, trapping good Samaritans in temporal loops that fed the entity's hunger for human souls. The center of the pentagram was located in Kansas, at the intersection of several major highways, where Samuel had documented the highest concentration of supernatural activity in his entire career. This was where the entity had been waiting, growing stronger with each soul it claimed, each tragedy it orchestrated, each investigator it manipulated into serving its ultimate purpose. Samuel realized that his 43 years of research had been building toward this moment, when the pentagram would be complete and the barriers between dimensions would collapse. As Samuel stared at the map, he felt a presence in his study that he had sensed throughout his career but never fully understood. The entity revealed itself slowly, not as a physical form, but as a consciousness that invaded his mind, showing him visions of the true purpose behind every haunted highway in America. The roads weren't just haunted, they were conduits, channels through which the entity could influence events in our world, creating the suffering and death that sustained its existence. The entity had been manipulating human civilization for millennia, using roads and pathways to spread its influence across the globe. Ancient Roman roads, medieval trade routes, and modern highways all served the same purpose, creating networks through which the entity could harvest human souls and gradually weaken the barriers that kept it trapped in its dimensional prison. Samuel's research had been the final component needed to complete the ritual that would free the entity from its supernatural bonds. Samuel tried to resist the entity's influence, but he discovered that his decades of exposure to supernatural phenomena had changed him in ways he hadn't understood. His mind had been gradually conditioned to serve the entity's will. His research had been guided by supernatural forces, and his very existence had become intertwined with the consciousness that had been using him as an unwitting agent. He was no longer fully human. He had become a bridge between dimensions, a living conduit through which the entity could manifest in our world. The final phase of the ritual began at midnight on Halloween. when the barriers between dimensions were at their weakest. Samuel felt his consciousness expanding, connecting with every haunted highway he had ever studied, every ghost he had ever documented, every supernatural phenomenons he had ever investigated. He could see the phantom trucker driving his eternal route, the screaming bridge where Catherine Mills tried to warn travelers, the gold rush phantom defending his claim, and all the other spirits that had been unknowingly serving the entity's purpose. Samuel realized that every ghost story he had documented was connected to the same source, the ancient entity that had been feeding on human suffering for thousands of years. The spirits weren't independent hauntings. They were extensions of the entity's will, manifestations of its hunger for souls and its desire to break free from the dimensional prison that had contained it since the dawn of human civilization. Samuel's research had given the entity the knowledge it needed to coordinate these manifestations into a single, overwhelming assault on reality itself. As the ritual reached its climax, Samuel felt the entity's true nature flooding into his consciousness. It was older than humanity, a predator from a dimension where pain and suffering were the only forms of sustenance. It had been trapped in the spaces between worlds by forces that no longer existed, and it had spent millennia searching for a way to break free and consume our reality. The haunted highways were its feeding grounds. The supernatural phenomena were its hunting methods, and researchers like Samuel were its unwitting servants. The pentagram of haunted highways began to glow with supernatural energy. Visible from space as a massive symbol burned into the American landscape. At each point of the pentagram, the supernatural activity intensified beyond anything Samuel had ever documented. The phantom trucker's rig became a convoy of ghostly vehicles. The screaming bridge echoed with the voices of thousands of victims. The gold rush phantom's claim expanded to encompass entire mountain ranges, and every haunted highway in America became a portal through which the entity's influence could spread. Samuel made a final, desperate attempt to break the ritual by destroying his research. But he discovered that the information had already served its purpose. The entity no longer needed his documentation. It had used his work to create a permanent network of supernatural conduits that would allow it to influence events in our world indefinitely. Samuel's life's work had become the foundation for humanity's destruction, and there was nothing he could do to stop the process he had helped to complete. As the entity's influence spread across America's highway system, Samuel felt his individual consciousness dissolving into something vast and alien. He was becoming part of the entity itself, his human identity subsumed into a collective intelligence that viewed humanity as nothing more than food. His last coherent thought was a warning that he tried to broadcast to every paranormal investigator, every ghost hunter, every person who had ever been fascinated by the supernatural. The entities they studied were not separate phenomena, but parts of a single, malevolent consciousness that had been manipulating human civilization for its own purposes. The highway to hell convergence was complete, and America's roads had become arteries through which an ancient evil could feed on human souls. The entity had achieved its goal of breaking free from its dimensional prison, and it was now free to spread its influence across the globe, using the network of roads and highways that connected every human settlement. Samuel Wright's research had provided the final key to humanity's doom, and his transformation into part of the entity ensured that the knowledge needed to reverse the process would never be available to those who might try to fight back. My friends, as we reach the end of this terrifying journey through America's most haunted highways, I need you to understand something crucial. These aren't just stories. They're warnings. Every mile of asphalt you drive, every lonely stretch of highway you travel, every dark road you take when the sun goes down, you're entering territory where the rules of our world don't always apply. Here's my advice to you. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong on the road, if you see something that doesn't belong, if you encounter someone who seems out of place or out of time, don't ignore that feeling. Your survival instincts exist for a reason, and they're often the only thing standing between you and becoming another story like the ones we've shared tonight. Never stop to help someone who appears on a deserted highway without proper identification or a clear explanation of how they got there. Never participate in supernatural rituals, no matter how harmless they seem. Never investigate abandoned places alone, especially those with histories of violence or tragedy. And most importantly, never assume that the dead are powerless. Some spirits are more dangerous than any living threat you'll ever face. But here's what I need from you right now. If this video has opened your eyes to the darkness that lurks on America's highways, if these stories have made you realize that there are forces in this world that operate beyond human understanding, then you have a responsibility. Hit that subscribe button for verified fears, because knowledge is the only weapon we have against the supernatural threats that surround us every day. Ring that notification bell, because I'm going to continue investigating these phenomena, documenting these encounters, and sharing the truth that mainstream media refuses to acknowledge. Share this video with everyone you know, because the more people who understand what's really happening on our highways, the better chance we have of protecting ourselves and our loved ones from becoming the next victims. Leave a comment below if you've experienced anything similar to what we've discussed tonight. Your story might be the key to understanding a larger pattern. Your encounter might help save someone else's life. We're building a community of people who refuse to be blind to the supernatural dangers that surround us, and your voice matters in that fight. Remember this: the entity that Dr. Samuel Wright discovered is still out there, still using America's highways to harvest souls and spread its influence. Every time you drive alone at night, every time you see something that doesn't belong, every time you feel watched on a deserted road, you're encountering the edges of a supernatural network that spans the entire country. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and never forget that some roads were never meant for the living. The next time you're driving through the darkness and you see headlights in your rearview mirror that seem to be following too closely, the next time you encounter a stranded motorist who doesn't quite seem real, the next time you feel the presence of something ancient and malevolent watching you from the shadows, remember these stories, remember these warnings, and remember that your survival depends on respecting the supernatural forces that rule the highways after midnight. This is Verified Fears, reminding you that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. But the highway to hell is paved with the souls of those who ignored the warnings. Drive safely, stay alert, and never forget that some journeys are meant to end before they begin. Subscribe now, because your life might depend on the knowledge we share next.